In 1975, a young biologist crawled into vampire bat roosts in Costa Rica for months, marking individual bats, tracking who they slept next to, and recording something that shouldn't have been possible in an animal with a brain the size of a thumbnail. He found bats that had successfully fed on blood that night, regurgitating part of their meal directly into the mouths of roost-mates who hadn't fed and were, quite literally, hours from starving to death. And when he tracked which bats helped which, the pattern wasn't random. The bats that had received blood in the past were overwhelmingly the ones giving it away now. That single discovery kicked off one of the strangest, most contested debates in animal behavior science, one that's still not fully settled today. Is that gratitude, or is it something that only looks like gratitude from the outside, while nothing resembling a feeling exists anywhere inside that bat's tiny brain? By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why scientists still can't agree on the answer, and why the truth is far stranger and far more interesting than a simple yes or no. Let's start with what gratitude actually requires, because that's where this entire debate hinges. In humans, gratitude isn't just noticing that something good happened to you. It requires recognizing that another individual deliberately chose to help you at some cost to themselves, and then forming a lasting positive feeling toward that specific individual because of it. That's a surprisingly complex mental task. It requires memory, it requires the ability to track who did what and when, and it requires something psychologists call theory of mind, the ability to understand that another creature has its own intentions and made its own choice to help you rather than simply stumbling into it by accident. So the real question driving animal researchers isn't simply, do animals help each other? Almost everyone agrees they do. The real question is whether any of that helping behavior comes with that same internal machinery running underneath it, or whether it's something else entirely, wearing gratitude's exact costume. Which brings us back to those vampire bats. The biologist's name was Gerald Wilkinson, and his 1984 study, published in the journal Nature, became one of the founding case studies in this entire field. Wilkinson found that vampire bats, which can die from starvation after skipping just 2 nights of feeding, regularly saved each other's lives through blood donation, and did so in a pattern that tracked prior relationships rather than random chance. A bat who had previously received blood from a specific roost mate was significantly more likely to return the favor to that same individual later. On the surface, this looks like exactly what you'd expect gratitude to produce. But here's where it gets complicated, and this is the exact point where the scientific argument still hasn't been resolved. Critics of the bats feel gratitude interpretation point to something called symmetry-based reciprocity. The argument goes like this. Bats that roost near each other and interact with each other constantly over months and years will naturally end up helping each other reciprocally, simply because proximity and repeated contact make that outcome statistically likely, with no memory of specific past favors required at all. In other words, it might look exactly like, you helped me, so now I'll help you, when what's actually happening is closer to, we're close associates, so of course we end up helping each other roughly equally over time, a much simpler mechanism that requires no gratitude, no memory of individual transactions, and no internal feeling whatsoever. This is where a primatologist named Frans de Waal enters the story, because he designed an experiment specifically built to cut through that exact ambiguity, and the result is one of the most cited pieces of evidence in this entire field. De Waal studied chimpanzees, and instead of just observing general helping behavior, he tracked precisely who groomed whom on a given day, and then, later that same day, introduced food into the enclosure. If chimpanzee food sharing was just about general closeness or friendship, food should have gone to whoever the chimp generally liked best. Instead, de Waal found something far more specific. Adult chimpanzees were significantly more likely to share food specifically with the individual who had groomed them earlier that exact day, regardless of their overall friendship status. That's not simple symmetry. That requires tracking a specific favor, from a specific individual within a specific window of time and then repaying it directly to that individual rather than distributing kindness generally. In scientific terms, that's called contingent reciprocity, and it's a meaningfully higher bar to clear than simple mutual backscratching. Now, before you assume this settles the debate entirely in favor of yes, animals feel gratitude, it's worth pointing out what Weil's chimpanzee study does and doesn't actually prove. It proves that chimpanzees can track specific favors and repay specific individuals accordingly. What it can't prove, and what no behavioral experiment currently can prove, is whether that tracking comes bundled with an actual subjective feeling, a genuine internal sense of warmth or appreciation toward the groomer, the same way a human feels genuine gratitude toward a friend who helped them move apartments. The behavior looks identical to what gratitude would produce. Whether there's something it feels like to be that chimpanzee in that moment is a question science currently has no reliable way to answer for any animal, including, frustratingly, humans studying other humans. This is actually one of the deepest problems in all of animal cognition research, and it's worth sitting with for a second because it applies to almost everything in this video. Scientists can measure behavior with total precision. They can track exactly which chimp shares food with exactly which other chimp, down to the specific day and the specific favor being repaid. What they cannot directly measure is subjective experience, what philosophers call qualia, the raw feeling of what it's like to be that animal in that instant. We can't even fully verify subjective experience in other humans. We simply assume it based on behavior and self-report, and animals can't self-report in language we understand. So every claim in this video about what animals feel comes with an asterisk that no amount of clever experimental design can currently remove. With that caveat firmly in place, let's look at where this research goes next, because vampire bats and chimpanzees are only the beginning. Impalas, the graceful antelope of the African savanna, engage in something researchers Benjamin and Lynette Hart documented as reciprocal allogrooming, mutual grooming used specifically to remove ticks from areas of the body an impala can't reach on its own, like its own neck and head. Just like the chimpanzees, this grooming isn't random. Impalas that receive grooming from a specific individual are more likely to return that exact favor later. And once again, the same fundamental ambiguity applies. Is this gratitude in miniature, or simply an efficient biological system that evolved because reciprocal grooming happened to work, with no feeling required at all to make the system function? More recent research has pushed this question even further into territory that makes the just mechanical reciprocity explanation harder to fully accept. A researcher named Gerald Carter, who has spent years continuing and expanding Wilkinson's original vampire bat research, has documented something that looks less like simple transactional exchange and more like something researchers are now cautiously willing to call friendship. Carter found that vampire bats build long-term social bonds gradually, starting with lower-cost interactions like grooming and only escalating to costly, potentially life-saving blood donation once that underlying relationship has been established over time. That's a meaningfully different picture than a cold, mechanical ledger of favors. It looks more like the bats are investing in specific relationships, the same way humans build friendships slowly, through smaller gestures, before those friendships are ever tested by something that actually costs us something significant. Birds add another fascinating layer to this puzzle, particularly corvids, the family that includes crows, ravens, and jays, widely considered among the most cognitively sophisticated non-primate animals on the planet. Researchers studying ravens have found that these birds keep remarkably detailed track of social exchanges within their groups, remembering which individuals have previously cheated them out of food or helped them access it, and adjusting their future behavior towards specific individuals accordingly, sometimes for weeks afterward. In some experiments, ravens that had recently helped a partner gain access to food were more likely to be tolerated near that partner's food later, a small but measurable form of social credit being tracked and repaid. What makes this particularly interesting is that birds and primates last shared a common ancestor roughly 300 million years ago, long before anything resembling a mammal, let alone a chimpanzee, existed. If both a raven's brain and a chimpanzee's brain, built through completely separate evolutionary paths, arrived at similar systems for tracking favors and adjusting future behavior accordingly, that's a strong signal that whatever this mechanism actually is, it's not some rare fluke. It may be something evolution reliably builds whenever a species becomes social enough and intelligent enough to benefit from remembering who helped whom. If any of this is changing how you picture the animal kingdom, and it changed how I pictured it while researching this, that's genuinely what keeps this channel going. And if you'd like to keep exploring the hidden science behind animal behavior, subscribing is the easiest way to make sure the next one finds you. Now, let's look at what might be the single most famous experiment in this entire field, one you may have already seen clips of online without knowing the deeper context behind it. That experiment involves capuchin monkeys and cucumbers and grapes. In a now famous study led by primatologist Sarah Brosnan alongside Dee Wahl, two capuchin monkeys were placed in side-by-side enclosures and trained to hand researchers a small stone in exchange for a reward. When both monkeys received the same reward, a slice of cucumber, both happily continued the exchange. But when one monkey started receiving a much more desirable grape for the exact same task, while the other continued receiving cucumber, something remarkable happened. The monkey receiving the lesser reward frequently refused to continue the exchange at all, sometimes throwing the cucumber back at the researcher entirely, visibly agitated by watching another individual receive better treatment for identical effort. This experiment is usually discussed as evidence of a sense of fairness in animals, rather than gratitude specifically, but it belongs in this conversation for an important reason. It shows that capuchin monkeys are tracking something far more sophisticated than simple reward and punishment. They're comparing their own treatment against another individual's treatment in real time and reacting emotionally to the comparison. If an animal's brain is sophisticated enough to register unfairness when it's shortchanged, that same cognitive machinery, tracking relative treatment between individuals, is very plausibly sophisticated enough to register the opposite, a positive response to being treated unusually well by a specific individual, which is functionally very close to what gratitude actually is. There's also a quieter, more counterintuitive body of research worth mentioning here, involving cleaner fish and their much larger client fish on coral reefs. Small, cleaner wrasse remove parasites from the skin of larger reef fish, an arrangement that benefits both parties enormously, since the wrasse gets an easy meal and the client fish gets rid of harmful parasites. Researchers studying these interactions found that client fish appear to remember which specific cleaning stations and even which specific individual cleaner fish treated them well in the past, returning preferentially to those same cleaners rather than choosing randomly among the many cleaning stations available on a reef. Fish are not typically considered candidates for anything resembling rich emotional experience, which makes this finding especially useful for this conversation. It suggests that at least some version of favor tracking, remembering who treated you well and preferentially returning to them, doesn't require a large brain, complex social bonds, or anything close to primate-level intelligence. It may be a far more basic, far more ancient behavioral tool than most people assume, one that long predates anything resembling what we'd recognize as an emotion at all. There's also a category of evidence that's much harder to formally study, but almost impossible to ignore if you've ever worked closely with animals. Cases involving dolphins, elephants, and dogs that appear to specifically seek out and behave differently toward humans who rescued or helped them. Wildlife rehabilitators and researchers have documented elephants that, years after being helped out of a snare or a mud hole by specific individuals, reacted with what looked like recognition and unusually gentle behavior toward those same people on later encounters, sometimes even after years apart. rescued dogs are frequently described by their owners as displaying behavior that looks distinctly different, more affectionate, more attentive, specifically toward the person who rescued them compared to strangers. Scientists are understandably cautious about this kind of evidence because it's largely anecdotal, difficult to control for, and easy to overinterpret through a very human lens. But it's also worth noting that difficult to formally study is not the same thing as false. Some of the most important discoveries in this field, including Wilkinson's original bat research, started as exactly this kind of informal, anecdotal observation before anyone designed a rigorous experiment around it. Dogs deserve their own specific mention here, if only because they're the animal most people actually ask this question about. Researchers studying dog-human bonding have found that mutual eye contact between dogs and their owners triggers a measurable rise in oxytocin, often called the bonding hormone, in both the dog and the human, the same neurochemical loop involved in bonding between human parents and infants. That doesn't prove a dog experiences something identical to human gratitude toward the person who feeds or rescues it, but it does show that dogs have been shaped through thousands of years of domestication to form neurochemically real attachments to specific humans, attachments that are reinforced, strengthened, and maintained specifically through positive treatment over time. Whether you want to call that gratitude, attachment, or simply a very effective evolutionary strategy for a species that survives by living alongside humans, the underlying biological reality is the same either way. Specific kindness from a specific person appears to leave a specific, measurable mark. This brings us to a concept researchers call anthropomorphism, the tendency to project distinctly human emotions and motivations onto animal behavior that might have a much simpler underlying explanation. It's a real and legitimate concern in this field, and good scientists take it seriously, specifically because human brains are wired to see intention and emotion everywhere, even in places it doesn't actually exist. But there's an opposite bias that gets far less attention, sometimes called anthropogenial, the reflexive assumption that animals couldn't possibly have anything resembling human emotion simply because they're not human. De Waal has argued for years that this second bias has quietly distorted animal behavior science for decades, leading researchers to underestimate animal cognition by default rather than genuinely testing for it with an open mind. The actual truth, according to researchers like De Waal, likely sits somewhere between these two extremes, closer to the animal's actual experience than skeptics assume, but almost certainly simpler and less human-shaped than an excited pet owner might assume. So, where does all of this actually leave us? Based on the current evidence, most researchers in this field land somewhere in what you might call the cautious middle, the purely mechanical explanation that animal helping behavior is just symmetry-based reciprocity with zero feeling attached struggles to explain findings like De Waal's same-day grooming for food experiment or Carter's evidence of gradually built social bonds in vampire bats. Those findings require memory, individual recognition, and behavior that tracks specific relationships rather than general proximity, which is a meaningfully higher bar than pure mechanical reflex. At the same time, the fully human interpretation, that a chimpanzee or a bat experiences something identical to the rich, self-aware feeling of gratitude a human feels, goes further than the current evidence can actually support, since we have no reliable way to measure subjective feeling in any species besides, imperfectly, our own. What the evidence does strongly support is something in between. Many social animals appear to possess at least a functional precursor to gratitude, a genuine cognitive and possibly emotional system that tracks specific favors from specific individuals and motivates a real behavioral response to repay them, built on memory, individual recognition, and something that reliably looks, from every angle science can currently measure, like it's actually being felt and not just performed. Whether that internal experience feels anything like your own gratitude when a friend helps you move, or whether it's simpler, dimmer, or entirely different in some way we can't currently imagine, remains one of the genuinely open frontiers of animal cognition research. So the next time you watch a video of a dolphin lingering near the person who freed it from a fishing net, or an elephant that seems to remember a park ranger years later, you're not necessarily watching a simple projection of human feelings onto an animal that has nothing going on inside. You might be watching one of the oldest, most widespread mental tools in the animal kingdom, quietly doing exactly what it evolved to do, forming a lasting bond with whoever proved through action that they could be trusted, whether or not that animal experiences it in anything resembling the way we do. If this is the kind of question you want more of, this channel keeps digging into exactly this territory, so subscribing means you won't miss what we dig up next.